Hi, welcome to the Personal History Hub. This video is all about the Prague Spring and the problems in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So, increased tension in Czechoslovakia. Since 1948, Czechoslovakia had in many ways been a model satellite state. The standard of living there was generally better than in other satellite states, and the Czechoslovakian government was obedient to the Soviet Union. However, in the 1960s, opposition to Soviet control grew for several reasons. Novotny's fall from power. Anton Novotny had been Czech leader since 1957. He was unpopular because he was a hardline communist who willingly followed the Soviet line and refused to introduce changes or reform. In addition, Novotny was slow to follow Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinisation. So, for example, getting rid of everything Stalin had put in place. He was especially slow to release political prisoners that were jailed under Stalin. A declining economy. The Czechoslovakian economy was in serious decline in the 1960s, and this decline led to a fall in the standard of living. The Soviet Union forced Czechoslovakian industry to produce materials such as steel for the Soviet economy, but the Czechoslovakian economy needed those raw materials for themselves. The Soviet Union also stopped Czechoslovakian factories from producing consumer goods. So basically, these type of goods are everyday things that people want, for example, a TV or a car. In 1962 to 63, the national income also fell. Novotny's attempts at reform after 1965, known as the New Economic Model, were unsuccessful, since they produced a surplus of consumer goods that most people couldn't afford. So when we say a surplus, we mean there's more goods available than the demand for it, than what people want. The failure of economic reform encouraged many Czechoslovakians to demand greater democracy. In October 1967, a number of reformers, including Alexander Dubček and an economist named Ota Sik, challenged Novotny's leadership at a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In December, Dubček invited Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union by 1968, to Prague. Brezhnev was surprised at the extent of opposition to Novotny. He withheld support for the Czechoslovakian leader. Novotny replaced. So on the 5th of January 1968, Novotny was replaced as first secretary of the Communist Party. So this was the top position in the party. He was replaced by Alexander Dubček. Brezhnev was seen to support this change. By March, Novotny resigned as president of Czechoslovakia and was replaced by General Ludvík Svoboda. Svoboda was a war hero. He supported Dubček's reform program, and Novotny had been removed from the two most powerful positions in the country. So, what were the Prague Spring reforms? The Prague Spring refers to a series of reforms or changes introduced by Dubček in the spring of 1968. The Czechs called it socialism with a human face. Dubček remained a devoted communist, but he wanted to win support for the communist regime by removing its worst features. So it's important to note that Dubček didn't want to get rid of communism in Czechoslovakia. He just wanted to change it slightly to make it more popular with the people. So his first reform was greater political freedom, including free speech, censorship to be ended, so freedom of the press, and by March 1968, newspapers were printing uncensored discussions of political and social problems. This had been illegal before. Coverage of news on the radio and TV became much fuller, and any political corruption was exposed by the media. Communist Party leaders were grilled on live TV for the first time. A 10-year programme for political change, which would bring about democratic elections through a multi-party state and create a new form of democratic socialism. The aim of the programme was to give the people of Czechoslovakia a greater say in the running of their country. The creation of works councils representing the workforce to improve working conditions in factories and increase rights for members of trade unions. A reduction in the powers of the secret police to imprison without trial, and the removal of travel restrictions and fresh contact with the West, such as trade with West Germany. So, what were the reactions to the Prague Spring? Dubček's reforms encouraged opponents of communism and led to demands for even more radical reforms. In June 1968, the Social Democrats began to form a separate party as a rival to the Communist Party. Around the same time, Ludwig Vakulik, a leading journalist, published a manifesto entitled The 2000 Words. In it, he called on the Czechoslovakian people to take the initiative and force even more extreme reforms. So the Soviet Union was suspicious of the changes taking place in Czechoslovakia for several reasons. Czechoslovakia was one of the most important countries in the Warsaw Pact. It was centrally placed and had the strongest industry. Brezhnev was worried that Czechoslovakia might leave the Warsaw Pact, allowing NATO to move in. This outcome was split the Eastern Bloc into two and advanced NATO's frontier 700 kilometres further to the east so that it bordered the Soviet Union itself. Okay, so if you look at the map carefully, you can see Czechoslovakia here, which actually does border both the Soviet Union and West Germany. So if Czechoslovakia left the Warsaw Pact, it would leave a big hole in the Iron Curtain. So other reasons for the invasion. The Soviets were worried that the new ideas in Czechoslovakia might spread to other European countries. Brezhnev came under pressure from the East German and Polish leaders to stop reform in Czechoslovakia. Vasil Bilak, the Slovakian Communist Party leader, was one of the 5 leading opponents of the Prague Spring reforms. These 5 leaders signed a letter sent to Brezhnev suggesting that the Communist Party itself was under threat in Czechoslovakia and asked him to use all means at your disposal to end these reforms. In other words, this meant invade. The Soviet Union were also afraid that Czechoslovakia was becoming closer to West Germany. Trade between them got stronger every day. Due to all of this tension caused by the Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in August 1968. So here is the timeline of events of the invasion. In June 1968, Soviet tanks remained in Czechoslovakia after Warsaw Pact military exercises. In July, Brezhnev met with leaders of the Warsaw Pact countries in Warsaw itself. They shared his concerns over events in Prague, and a few days later, Brezhnev met with Dubček. Dubček agreed not to allow a new Social Democratic Party and to remain in the Warsaw Pact. However, he insisted on going ahead with his reform plan, and the Soviet Union seemed reassured and tensions eased temporarily. By the 3rd of August, Brezhnev and representatives from Warsaw Pact countries met with Dubček in Bratislava and signed the Bratislava Declaration, declaring their faith in communism. Once again, Brezhnev seemed to be reassured. On the 9th of August, the leader of Yugoslavia, Tito, who was distrusted by the Soviet Union, was given an enthusiastic reception during a visit in Czechoslovakia. It seemed yet again that Dubček was moving towards independence from the Soviet Union. Between the 15th and the 18th of August 1968, 3-day meeting sessions of the Soviet Politburo, which is the supreme policy-making body of the Soviet Communist Party, decided what action to take. Brezhnev spoke to Dubček on the phone, shouting at him that his actions in Prague would bring down the Warsaw Pact. On the 20th of August, the Soviet Union decided to invade Czechoslovakia. So, re-establishing Soviet control. On the 20th to the 21st of August 1968, thousands of Soviet troops, backed by units from Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary, and Poland, entered Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakians threw petrol bombs at the Soviet tanks as they moved through Prague. Buildings were set on fire and protesters assembled in Wenceslas Square. Barricades were set up in the streets and students tore down street names to confuse invaders. Some students even climbed onto the tanks and tried to argue with the Soviet soldiers. Anti-Soviet broadcasters stayed on the air by moving from one hiding place to another. However, there was no armed resistance by the Czechoslovakian army, and fewer than 100 people were actually killed. Dubček and the other leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow, where they were forced to accept the end of Czechoslovakia's move towards democracy. Over the next few years, hardline Czechoslovakian officials replaced the reforming Czech leaders. So, what is the Brezhnev Doctrine and why is it important? The Soviets used propaganda to show that events in Czechoslovakia were a serious threat to the Soviet Union. In August 1968, Leonid Brezhnev, who had taken over as leader of the Soviet Union from Khrushchev in 1964, introduced something called the Brezhnev Doctrine. He did this to justify the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia. According to the doctrine, the Soviet Union had the right to invade any country in Eastern Europe whose actions appeared to threaten the security of the whole of the Eastern Bloc. Brezhnev insisted that the Soviet Union had no choice but to invade because the actions taken by Dubček threatened the Warsaw Pact and Soviet control of Eastern Europe. This doctrine also redefined communism as a one-party system and declared that all member countries had to remain part of the Warsaw Pact. The invasion also sent out a message to the members of the Warsaw Pact that the Soviet Union would suppress or put down any attempts to relax communist control. Brezhnev even stated that if a capitalist country threatened any communist country, then the other communist states had the right to intervene by using force. So, what were the consequences of the Soviet invasion for Czechoslovakia? Demonstrations against the Soviet invasion went on until April 1969. In January 1969, Jan Palach, a student, set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square in protest against the Soviet invasion. Nevertheless, the Czech Communist Party was purged and Dubček was forced to resign. He was replaced by Gustav Husak, a man who was happy to revert Czechoslovakia back to strict communist rule. Dubček was not executed but was sent as ambassador to Turkey and then forced to resign altogether from the Communist Party. The consequences for US-Soviet relations. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia temporarily worsened relations between East and West. Western countries, especially Britain and the USA, protested about Soviet actions. Despite the protests, the Soviet invasion did not really endanger Soviet-American relations as previous crises had. Détente continued after a slight break, and the reason there was no real deterioration in the relationship was because the USA was in the middle of a presidential election during 1968, and they were also preoccupied with the Vietnam War. Behind closed doors, Brezhnev and US President Lyndon B. Johnson had unspoken deal that the USA would not intervene in Czechoslovakia, as long as the Soviet Union did not intervene in Vietnam. So although America publicly condemned the invasion, they offered no military support to Czechoslovakia. The events in Czechoslovakia reduced international criticism of the USA's involvement in Vietnam, as the Soviets' invasion of their own allies seemed far worse. So what were the consequences for Western Europe? Western European countries followed America's lead. They condemned the invasion but sent no military help. Some Western European communist parties, for example in Italy and France, were outraged by the Soviet invasion, and they formally declared themselves independent of the Soviet Communist Party. The Soviet Union increasingly lost influence in these Western European countries, so they began to develop their own form of European communism known simply as Eurocommunism. And then finally, the consequences of the invasion for communist countries. The invasion of Czechoslovakia increased the rivalry between China and the Soviet Union. China criticized the use of force against a fellow communist nation, and the Chinese feared that the Soviet Union might take the same action against them. Furthermore, other communist countries began to move away from Moscow. So, for example, the president of Romania, Ceausescu, refused to send troops to support the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. After this, they followed a more independent line against the Soviet Union. Albania did the same and decided to leave the Warsaw Pact for good in 1968. The Yugoslavian and Romanian governments both condemned the Soviets and distanced themselves from them. After 1968, both Yugoslavian and Romanian communists formed alliances with China. The Soviet Union did not react because it was preoccupied with the events in Czechoslovakia. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub.